The small intestine separates and secretes what is clear from what is turbid, murky. This function of separating the pure from the impure in the small intestine is most representative on a psychic level. It is the clear separated by the small intestine that ascends to the upper jaw, thanks to the ascent of the spleen, sending the excess via sanjiao to the bladder. On the other hand, solid waste, along with the remaining turbid liquids, will pass to the large intestine. Therefore, considering this, the small intestine governs the Ye, the turbid fluids. Suwen 8 states that the small intestine has the function of receiving and giving in abundance. The transformation of beings and things arise from it. In case of fullness, the Jinye stagnate and cannot irrigate the bones. The joints relax and the elbows become paralyzed. Let's break it down. Jean-Marc Quespi tells us that the small intestine is the earth of the heart. It's associated viscera, thus the one that materializes. We're still in the reception phase, and not just receiving, it receives in abundance. Jean-Marc Eiselet says that it has the ability to transform foods modified by inputs from digestive juices, turning them into nutrients, meaning they lose their original identity. It transforms them. Elisabeth Rochat de la Vallée also states that the product of the small intestine becomes something belonging to the individual. So the small intestine absorbs and incorporates through a transformation and probably manages the Ye. This is my idea because if it becomes something belonging to the individual, it's something deeply embedded. Not the Jin, it's the Ye. Marie-Christine Essartier, in the Banquet des Points 69, said that the small intestine, associated with the heart, which is love, takes and absorbs everything, meaning it's not selective initially. As the earth of the heart, it hosts the heart's fire and Shen because it is its earth, and insists, from another perspective, on this function of relating from the external to the internal. She says that small intestine is related to what is manifested, to appearance, the visible, nature, the external world. And Carlo di Stanislao also gives us another interesting insight. He says the small intestine is related to creativity, in that new ideas and images from the environment nourishing the individual, stimulating evolution and changing their system of beliefs and values. In essence, the small intestine absorbs from the outside to transform and make it ours, but in doing so, it's also transforming us. And Quespi agrees with Carlo di Stanislao. He says, the small intestine allows itself to be transformed in accordance with the laws of heaven. Well, of course, it's the earth of the heart, and obviously, as a Fu, it manages transitions and transformations in a discreetly different way than the large intestine, as we'll see later. And before moving to the next phase, let's emphasize, of all the Fu, the visceras, along with the stomach, the small intestine is the least selective. It absorbs and takes in everything that's given to it. The transformation Hua it exerts changes things completely, and, as I mentioned earlier, us too. However, Suwen's phrase went further. It was very brief. The small intestine receives, with making it fruitful under the action of the fire it receives from the heart. Let's think of the small intestine-heart relationship in the same way, and this is my opinion, that there would be between kidney and bladder, as we'll see later, which I haven't explained yet. And with what it receives from the stomach, it performs a settling and distillation, separating the pure from the impure, the solid from the liquid, and clear as always. This has physical and psychic repercussions. From a physical point of view, Sully de Moran tells us that it acts on the digestion of meats and also fats, with a reciprocal reception on the gallbladder, which, as I mentioned in the YouTube playlist videos, is right at the center of the territory, initiating, adjusting, and reviewing all these dynamics. But there doesn't seem to be unanimity, because while Sully de Moran says that the difficulty of the small intestine is in digesting meat and fats, Kespi says that there is intolerance to raw foods. And Sierreta, an older author, said that indigestion was related to green legumes. So, among meats, fats, raw foods, and green legumes, there's a lot in play. Although in the rest of the clinical realm, there's more agreement. Abdominal pains. Several authors mention radiating to the lumbar spine, diarrhea, and also urinary disturbances. Let's not forget that we're still talking about the viscera participating in the global path of the Jinye. And what happens on the psychic level? As the small intestine hosts the heart's shen to make it fruitful, if it can't do so, this unmoored, volatile shen detaches. This manifests as anxiety, difficulty in focusing and concentrating, emotional instability, and insomnia. The psyche pathology is the person who is unable to separate the pure from the impure, the individual who doesn't know what to do, doesn't know which option to take, isn't clear, doubts, the incapacity to rationalize, and therefore, and this is another characteristic of the small intestine, the difficulty or impossibility of concluding what is undertaken. In other words, the person gets stuck, can't plan properly, or has it clear, and therefore the result is not concluding it. But I will also add the opposite, the need to organize, to discriminate what is mine, what is not mine, to rationalize everything excessively. Usually, pathology, all pathologies, can be found at the extremes. There's a clinical case by Jean-Marc Kespi, published in the French Acupuncture Journal, number 176, in which he assumes that a patient needs to be treated with a point of the small intestine because, as he describes her, she is a structured, intelligent, and very affectionate, remember the heart, but is unable to conclude things. And this is interesting because Elisabeth Rochette de la Vallée tells us that the function of the small intestine is sheng, which means receiving to make prosper, which is the burden of the small intestine, seen as its function in the state. And of course, to make prosper means making things happen, emerge, and work. What would be the command points of this Fu? Renmai 4 is the mu point, the alarm point of the small intestine. However, acupuncturist Sierreta many years ago stated that stomach 24 was also one. Additionally, Kespi, in his book Acupuncture in 1982, claimed that both stomach 23 and stomach 24 were mu points of the small intestine because they have a very close relationship with this viscera. However, in his latest publication, From Symbol to Clinical Practice, neither of these two acupoints is considered a mu point of the small intestine. But since when I noticed this, I had already created this video explaining the other 2 points, And as they do indeed have a close link to this Fu, even though officially we're not going to consider them moo points of the small intestine, I have decided to include them. Because this kind of herald of being the moo point of something is fine if the clinical indications and the patient coincide. But if not, if there's another point that, due to the patient's typology, gets closer to them, for example, if it's a patient with Yang Ming typology, we'll talk about these things Sunday, or because the clinic is more suggestive in their case, it turns out that there is no point that is more important than the others, which is something that catches my attention. When I was teaching, there was sometimes discussion among teachers about whether students should be tested on the locations of all the points. Often there was talk about which were the important points they should know. This is something that has always caught my attention because, in my opinion, if a point resolves a patient's clinic, it's a fundamental acupoint for them. Another very different thing is that we consider important points as those we usually use, probably because we believe we know them better and are more familiar with them. Therefore, in this video, even though they are not considered moo points of the small intestine, we shall also explore stomach 23 and stomach 24, so that you can include them among your therapeutic options. Let's start with Renmai 4. It is known as Guanyuan, the passage of origin, and I'll begin by discussing its clinical indications. As well as the points I'll mention, these indications come from a compilation of various classical texts and reliable authors, to which I've added symptoms resolved solely by stimulating a single acupoint, either reported by other authors or through my personal experience. Generally, Renmai 4 addresses exhaustion, deep internal cold, fatigue, and essence Jing deficiency, which manifests in patients with a weak constitution, significant thinness, chronic pathologies, and premature aging. It primarily treats wind patterns in the upper part of the body and upward yang movements, probably due to a lack of yin production, as we shall see. In essence, Guanyuan's Renmai 4 dynamic is to induce yang, to set yin in motion, as if striking a match to light the wood, yin, deep within the pelvic cavity. The relationship between the small intestine and agent fire Fu and its ability to apply fire aligns with the point's function, essentially nurturing yin. We're talking about essence, Jing, and wind patterns in the upper part. Renmai's 4 emergence of yin, with a continuous yin-yang dynamic, arises from the point's action, which is applying fire to generate, by mutation, and mobilize yin. Stomach 23 corresponds to the small intestine, Fu, where the separation of pure and turbid begins in the Jinye Pathway. It represents the earth of the heart, exercising the small intestine's function to fix and materialize the heart's action, allowing Shen to settle on the heart and, consequently, irrigate all our territories. Stomach 23 psychological clinic presents difficulty concentrating, overexcitement, mental dementia, wandering without focus, agitation, emotional instability, restlessness, anxiety, insecurity, isolating oneself, loneliness, fleeing, leaving home, insomnia, wandering thoughts, hysteria, acting erratically, melancholy, depression. The broad range of psychological clinical manifestations all indicate a disconnection from one's life source, wandering as if exiled from their center, the heart. Jean-Marc Espy suggests that what stomach 23 does is reconnect the individual with what he terms the source of life, which is the heart's shen. It can treat individuals lacking vital drive, depression due to their disconnection from the source of their psychic energy, as well as those wandering because they have lost contact with that source. They have let go like a balloon and are wandering. By the way, stomach 23 is called Taiyi, which can be translated as supreme unity, the highest level of being. Finally, we have the third point attributed as the stomach mu, stomach 24, Huaroumen, which translates to sliding flesh gate. The clinical indications of this point heavily involve mucous membranes, starting with the oral mucosa. There are glossitis, canker sores, tongue wounds, as well as rigid tongue, gastric issues such as inflammation, nausea, vomiting, and intestinal problems, especially triggered by certain foods. Kespi says raw foods. On the contrary, Philippe Sionneau suggests meat causes indigestion concerning this acupoints pathology. Lower down, we encounter diarrhea and renal problems like nephritis. Finally, lumbago and some female gynecological alterations outlines stomach 24 clinical manifestations. According to another French acupuncturist, Labourier, Huaroumen facilitates assimilation. He defines the patients who could be treated with stomach 24 as people delicate in assimilating the sliding commitment in a random process like a slide in the digestive tract, as well as, for instance, the relationships with others without overly panicking. Apparently, the patient can control the situation, but the procession is internal. I hope you'll get used to the sometimes slightly baroque plastic metaphors of the French authors, which on the other hand are extremely illustrative and rich, allowing us to visualize the type of person who could be treated by each point. According to Jean-Marc Espy, stomach 24 is also a heart-earth point, fixing the heart's fire and making it fruitful. He adds that pathology in this point manifests as a coexistence of fire affecting the heart, as we see in clinic, and difficulty digesting foods, raw foods, he says. Indeed, on a psychological level, Huaroumen's pathology manifests as anxiety, overexcitement, constant laughter. This is heart fire. Insomnia, erratic behavior, Dian Quang madness, dementia, need for control, inability to delegate, insecurity, fear of changes. As we see, this closely aligns with what Le Labourier said about the difficulty of assimilating and adapting to life's vicissitudes. It can also be about someone who bears loneliness poorly, or conversely, seeks it. That solitary individual with a tendency towards depression. After outlining the essence of the dynamics of these three small intestine mu points, we see common elements, but also distinct nuances in their clinical manifestations. Presenting them intends to assist, as it has for me, in prioritizing the isolated stimulation which works best of the point. Finally, all authors converge again that the bladder shoe point for the small intestine is bladder 27, which I won't analyze now. I find it very interesting to observe the complexity of these relationships, because we had seen that point stomach 23 was on the horizontal in the metameric level of Renmai 10, which is somewhat the lower gate of the stomach. In other words, among the three stomach nuclei outlined by these points, Renmai 13, Renmai 12, and Renmai 10, which I won't delve into now, we found the one that in that tripartition would be at the earth level, that is, the most earthly. So the mu point of the turbid, in line with the one which also corresponds to the earth, is in Piao Li relationship with the heart, which is the clear of the clear, the supreme. And if you review my Glimpses playlist video, where we discussed the symbolism of the number 2, we explained that there's an inversion of terms between anterior heaven and posterior heaven. And again, here we find that the Fu that makes the Shen fruitful as its clearest, it's situated in the darkest of the turbid. Let's return to the parallels. Another mu point of the small intestine, stomach 24, is on the horizontal in the metamere of Renmai 9, which, as you all must know, is a point heavily involved in the management of the Jinye, the liquids. Well, we find that it's called Huaroumen sliding flesh gate. Of course, for it to slide, it must be moist. And we find that this acupoint is in the metamerism of another point that has a significant action on all fluids. Furthermore, these two small intestine mu points are on the meridian of Zhu-Yang-Ming, stomach. But let's not think of stomach. Let's consider the Zhu-Yang-Ming meridian, whose function, as we already explained as an example in one of the videos on my playlist titled An Introduction to Acupuncture, as we said, the function of the Zhu-Yang-Ming meridian is the incorporation of the external world into the human. We translated it as stomach because it's associated with this viscera, but now we see that, for instance, some small intestine mu points, which also participate in the process of absorbing the external world, are on this meridian and resonate at points on it. Let's not lose sight at any moment that the absorption of the world is not only physical food, but also psychological. How do I manage this avalanche of information, which is what we found in stomach 24? Well, I couldn't resist starting to make sense of the whole, to begin to glimpse with you the marvel of the complexity that constitutes the tough system of Chinese medicine regarding the functions of man, as well as the numerous parallels that account for the enormous internal cohesion of this representation system of man, which is acupuncture.